From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Jerry Feierstein, Senior Vice President at the Middle East Institute, standing in this week for Alastair Taylor. The U.S. negotiator for talks with the Afghan Taliban, Zal Khalilzad, told the Afghan press September 2nd that his negotiations with the Taliban have concluded and that there's an agreement in principle between the parties that is awaiting approval by President Trump. Although all of the details of the purported agreement are not yet known, the U.S. has agreed to withdraw some 5,000 troops from Afghanistan within 6 months in exchange for a Taliban pledge to ensure that Afghanistan will not be used again as a base for violent extremist groups to attack the U.S. and its allies. For its part, the Afghan government was non-committal after being briefed on the agreement by Khalilzad, and the violence in the country continues as an explosion rocked the capital even as Khalilzad was briefing the press on the deal. What does this mean for the future of Afghanistan? After nearly 20 years of U.S. engagement, will the hard-won gains that the Afghan people have made in democratization, equal rights, and economic advancement be sustained? Or is this a repeat of the decent interval that marked the end of U.S. military operations in South Vietnam, only to see that country fall to the communists 2 years later? Here to help me answer these questions are two of our most experienced South Asia hands. Ambassador Raphel was a career Foreign Service officer with long service in the region, including several stints in Pakistan. In 1993, she was named Assistant Secretary in the newly formed South Asia Bureau at State. During her tenure, Raphel became the first U.S. diplomat to meet with the Taliban, who had seized power in Kabul in 1996, after several years of bloody infighting in Afghanistan among rival Mujahideen groups. So we can say that Robin was Khalilzad before Khalilzad. In 2009, Robin joined the AFPAC team under Richard Holbrooke and returned again to Pakistan, where she led the implementation of the non-military assistance program under the Kerry-Lugar legislation. Robin continued to work on AFPAC issues after her return to Washington in 2011. Dr. Marvin Weinbaum is the director of the Afghanistan and Pakistan program at the Middle East Institute and a professor emeritus in political science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Ambassador Raphel, Dr. Weinbaum, thank you for joining us today. Robin, let me ask the first question of you. Several of our colleagues who served in senior positions in Kabul published an opinion piece in the Atlantic Council on September 3rd, stating that, and this is a quote, "A few critical guardrails stand out in order to avoid the risk of Afghanistan becoming a new center of terrorism, harboring groups dedicated to attacking the United States, and to avoid betraying our own values by depriving Afghans of the chance to determine their own future," end quote. Based on our current understanding of the details, do you believe that the agreement Khalilzad negotiated maintains those guardrails?
Thank you, Jerry. First of all, let me emphasize that I certainly do not know the details of this agreement, and I don't think our colleagues who wrote that article do either. Seems to me that they have an early case of buyer's remorse. All of these colleagues have, at one point or another, favored talks with the Taliban, recognizing that there's no military solution to the Afghanistan problem. But as the deal is coming closer, and I think I would emphasize, as it's been done in secret and people don't know the details, they tend to fear the worst and get cold feet. So I think that's partly what's going on here. They mention that there's an outcome worse than the status quo. I think that's true, but I wouldn't assume that that outcome is an outcome that's terribly likely, a return to total civil war. And I would also emphasize that the status quo, sometimes we don't recognize that it has a lot of downsides as well. And I think the primary one is that it doesn't allow Afghanistan to really move forward, develop indigenous institutions and so on. In a way, the status quo holds Afghanistan back from its natural political evolution. And I think that's very costly. And then the other problem is that a lot of Afghans are dying in the status quo as well. So I don't really agree that is the main problem. They speak of American values, and I think American values in terms of the progress that has been made in human rights, women's rights particularly, are extremely important. And I think what Ambassador Khalilzad has said, and others have echoed, that the Afghan state that emerges after this negotiation is going to remain highly dependent on outside support. And it is very clear that there will be no outside support, none, from the United States, from our European allies, from others, if the new state doesn't respect these fundamental rights. So I think that is enormous leverage that we sometimes do not appreciate. They also speak of the need for the election to take place on schedule at the end of September, suggesting that the respect for the Constitution and that election is part of the American value system. I would argue that the legitimacy of the Constitution and government is a bit fuzzier than that. I mean, part of the problem for the Afghan government is that it hasn't been viewed as legitimate, because the election was flawed, there's a lot of corruption, and it hasn't been able to deliver beyond Kabul on some of the most basic governance issues. So I wouldn't stake American values on that election per se. And finally, they do say that there's no consensus on a so-called interim or transitional government. I think that's true, but I think there are certainly lots of possible mechanisms to reach that. And again, we don't know if that's in any kind of agreement and what is to be done in that regard. And I think I would say make one more point, and that is I think the goal has been from the beginning to make the political dispensation, the future political dispensation, a decision of the Afghans. And that is what will transpire in this intra-Afghan dialogue. And the goal of the U.S. Taliban deal was to set the stage for that dialogue. So I think we just now have to wait and see how it all works out.
Well, I want to come back to that, but well,
may I comment on, because I've got a more jaundiced view on this, and Robin and I have gone around on this for a long time. I start from the premise that from the day one, the Taliban has not been negotiating in good faith. I think they have led others to believe that they were amenable to a real compromise and power sharing, or at least they were willing to explore that. My own view, as I say, is premised on the fact that I believe the Taliban have always sought and have never denied that what they want is the restoration of an Islamic emirate, along the lines of what they had in the 1990s, perhaps somewhat more inclusive, perhaps more tolerant, but all within the rubric of a Sharia state as they define it. So I believe that what we're dealing with here is a situation where what is likely to emerge, I fear, from what we're seeing now, is a situation where the international community will disengage, and it will be thrown to the Afghans to sort out things. We didn't start at that point. We said we were going to condition this on progress in making a new state, if they could manage to do that. And we said that we also needed at least progress, if not a complete ceasefire, then something close to that. We're not getting either, as I know, and I agree with Robin that we don't really have all the details here. There are a number of things about elections, about leaving any troops behind at all, which we don't know yet until we see the actual draft. But I see and fear that we will be leaving them in the lurch here, that we will be throwing this in their lap, and that they are not prepared for this either diplomatically or militarily. Not militarily, because once we honor this in any form, which means a reduction of air support, this is really the pin that I think, if pulled, brings the Afghan security forces down. That's a critical element here. And on the diplomatic side, I think that they have demonstrated in the past, the Afghans, that if simply left on their own, they can't agree on anything. And if what is now being called for as an interim government, I fear, again, that while the Taliban can say, here are 3 people who we think should serve in that government, on the other side, they would fight for a year and a half over who would be on that team, supposedly representing the Afghan people. And I say Afghan people because it's very clear that the Taliban have no interest in negotiating or including in this kind of dialogue, which is supposed to take place, the sitting government in Afghanistan. So in effect, what they're doing here is they're rejecting the political system. And I think that's critical. As they have the vision here of an Islamic government, they are rejecting the idea that there ought to be political parties, there ought to be a parliament, there ought to be a constitution. And they have always made it crystal clear that that is the way they feel. But we haven't wanted to listen. One last point here, and that is as far as their being now dependent upon on the outside, and that this will make them more amenable to outside pressures. I think that outside pressure is going to come because the support is going to come from radical Islamic elements in the region, and those are the people they're going to come to depend on. So it's not going to be the kind of modifying or positions that I think we would prefer to see.
Well, let me go back to Robin then and ask her this question. I mean, Zal briefed Ashraf Ghani. And what we heard from the presidential palace is that Ghani only said that he would assess the agreement and draw a conclusion. Khalilzad is briefing the other political leadership in Kabul, I guess with the idea that he's going to try to win their support for this agreement, presumably before he comes back and briefs the president. A lot of it seems to depend on what might come out of an Afghan negotiation that is allegedly, again, according to Zal, going to be established perhaps in Oslo. What can we expect from the Afghan leadership, and how are they going to approach this? And do you believe that, in fact, the Afghans will be able to, amongst themselves, come up with a conclusion? They did, after all, in Berlin, in the Jirga in 2002, I guess, reach a conclusion. They did manage, with a lot of outside hand-holding, but they did manage to come to a conclusion. Can they do it again, this time with the Taliban in the room? What's your thought? You've negotiated with the Taliban. What do you think?
Well, I think it's very difficult to know. I think it's very difficult to know. I would also say, again, we do not know the details of this agreement. We do not know that there's no conditionality. I somehow suspect that there probably is. As to whether they can come to an agreement, yes, it's very fractious. We all know that the Afghan political class is very fractious. I think that in Oslo, and that's definitely the plan, there will be facilitation, there will be mediation even, not by the Americans, but the Americans will be behind the curtain or, in the anteroom or whatever. So there will be an effort to help the various sides articulate exactly what their needs are and their bottom lines need to be. So I think there's a chance. I definitely do. I am not sure that Marvin is right about this view being retained by the Taliban that they have to have an Islamic emirate, that is what they're looking for. I'm not sure it's clear to them what the alternative to that is, but I think there's been progress in walking them away from thinking that's what they can achieve. It is true that the confusion in Washington over the last year or so hasn't helped. It has confused the Taliban as well as others as to what the U.S. was really on about. But I think that the negotiating team has worked hard to sort of block out the noise and help the Taliban block out the noise and have very serious discussions. So, as to whether the Taliban are sincere in this negotiation, I happen to think they are. I think they recognize that this is a different time from the 1990s, mostly because Afghanistan's more connected to the rest of the world. And the Taliban leadership are sending their kids to school, their girls to medical school in the Gulf. Let's be honest here, things have evolved for them. They do have a problem of bringing their fighters along. That's always the case in any negotiation between the leadership and those who are on the forefront of the fighting, but that's not an unknown problem in the world. So I'm not as pessimistic as Marvin in all of this. I do think there's a possibility, and I think a lot more groundwork has been laid than we realize because, quite remarkably, the details of this discussion and negotiation have been kept quiet.
Let me stay with you for a second, Robin, and ask another question. It's true, as both of you have said, that we don't know all of the details of this agreement. But what we do know, or think we know, based on the press reporting, is that the Taliban, in exchange for the downsizing of the U.S. military presence, have made certain commitments about ensuring that Afghanistan doesn't return to the old days of becoming a hotbed, a safe haven for violent extremist groups. We know Al-Qaeda is still there. We know the Islamic State is there. The Taliban supposedly have committed to preventing them from threatening the U.S. or our friends and partners around the world. Do they, even if they have the will, do they have the capacity to actually fulfill that obligation? I
think you've hit the nail on the head on the most important question. I personally think and prepared to believe they have the will because, they've been fighting ISIS. Al-Qaeda was foisted upon them back in the 90s, and they basically don't like foreigners. They're a nationalist group. So I'm prepared to believe that they would like to not have to cooperate with foreigners. Whether they have the capacity, I think it's pretty clear that no one does. We and they and the Afghan security forces all in our different way fighting these people, and we haven't succeeded in keeping them at bay. So that leads me to believe there has to be, more to that commitment. And I think my own view is that they're going to need international help to do that. How that's arranged, I don't know, but that, I think...
And that could, of course, include leaving some of our special operations
or
people.
Having some of them return.
Yeah. Marvin, going back, you talked a lot about the political environment in Kabul and the presidential election that's scheduled for September 28th. There have been some statements by some of the potential candidates that they would be willing to withdraw their candidacy, perhaps to create some kind of a national unity front or something else. What's your expectation for how the Ashraf Ghani regime is going to handle this upcoming election, what's going to come out of it, or alternatively, are they going to cancel the elections and try to move forward with some kind of, again, national unity government that doesn't require a new election?
What we have to see here is whether in the terms of the agreement, they're going to foster a interim government, force it upon, really, Ashraf Ghani. Ashraf Ghani wants to have the elections badly. His regime is illegitimate until there is an election. That is, his term ended back in May. So if he is going to be a player in this at all, he has to have an election. If, however, there is an agreement which is forced upon him to accept an interim government, this changes everything as far. Then, in effect, there is no longer the constitutional system. And it is a real question about what then happens. As I suggested before, just to form this interim government may itself be an enormous task. And in that sense, when they go to Oslo, we'll assume they will, and we don't know, they could go there, have a couple of meetings, they could break up. I don't think it will. I think it's in the Taliban's interest, if nothing else, to string this along until the international forces leave. But I submit to you, look how long it's taken, 9 rounds of negotiations just to agree on what would seem to be a rather simple issue about we're promising you that we're not going to get close to al-Qaeda and terrorist groups on one side, and on the other side that we promise, in fact, we will act on a withdrawal. It took all this time. So what I'm saying is all the tough questions, that was the easy part, and it took them this long to do it. Now comes the question, when you're forming a government, every single item is a matter of debate. Yes, you can go back to 2001, 2002, the Bonn Agreement, yes. You can go back to that. And this is among the victors. They could not agree on what it was to win, what that meant. And the only reason that they came out of that meeting was because not only did the United States sit on them and said, if you can't agree, we're not going to help you one iota, but they enlisted the Russians and the Iranians to say the same. That message got across to them. Had the Taliban been there, there was no chance that there would have been any kind of agreement. So what I'm saying is that all the hard work is ahead. And under the best of circumstances, what we're looking at here is perhaps years of negotiation. But meanwhile, the country is not standing still. There's a war going on. There's a peace now, conceivably, between the Taliban, who said they're not going to attack American troops as they leave, and the U.S., which says that we have a timeline here that we're going to follow. Yes, it's condition-based, but we gave you a timeline nevertheless. So there we have an understanding here about what can be done in this period of time. So I'm just concerned here that there will not be really the kind of pressure on them in Oslo, which would force them into agreements on anything right away. And the point I wanted to make about the military side is, meanwhile, the Taliban have been getting stronger and stronger and stronger, more audacious in their attacks. The fighting now may have ended between the United States and the Taliban, but it goes on and conceivably will accelerate once the U.S. forces bring down their level of troop commitment. So I'm trying to be a realist here. We've got to be careful we're not governed by hopeful thinking about what could happen, but we have to go on what we know about the behavior of the Taliban to this point. Finally, let me say that this will not be, I think, like the 1990s, when the Taliban succeeded as the government failed, and one replaced the other. Neither side now is as united as they were then. On one hand, you had the Northern Alliance. On the other hand, you had a cohesive Taliban under Mullah Omar. Massoud on one side, Omar on the other side. Today, it's a much more diversified, decentralized kind of adversarial relationship. And as a result of that, once the forces come into play here, and we'll then not see one transfer to the other, but that is when I think is the danger of a civil war, especially if the ANA, the army, take their weapons and their know-how and they go back and join local militias. And on the Taliban side, we've already seen enormous defections at the field level. The Islamic State is made up of defectors of both the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban. So that's where we are, I think, at this point. And that's what leads me to think that the next step, if they fail, is a civil war, and a bloody, prolonged civil war in which no one is the winner.
We have time for maybe one more question, and let me put it to both of you. And that is, Marvin, you mentioned the role of the Russians and the Iranians in Bonn in 2001, 2002. Both of you follow developments in Pakistan very closely. You know that there's probably nobody who's been watching the progress of the Khalilzad negotiations more closely than the Pakistani leadership, both civilian and military. What is your sense of where they are on all of this, as well as, if you want to throw in, where the Iranians and the Russians are? Robin, you want to kick off?
Well, speaking of Pakistan, I think it's interesting. A year ago, just as Ambassador Khalilzad was taking up his charge, there was great concern that the Pakistanis wouldn't work with him. He had a long history of vociferous public criticism of Pakistan's Afghanistan policy. And so people thought, oh no, this isn't going to work. But in fact, because Khalilzad was really empowered, for the first time, the U.S. was taking seriously the political track in Afghanistan, which the Pakistanis had been advising for a long time. In fact, they accepted his role and have, as I understand it, really been extremely helpful. It's not to say they won't hedge again. They have a long history of hedging, but if it looks like there's going to be a settlement that takes into account their security concerns, which have to do, as we all know, with India's role in Afghanistan, and that should be manageable, I think. I think they've been helpful. Up to this point, all signs are that they've been extremely helpful, and whenever there's been an obstacle, they've pushed the Taliban to be more flexible and so on and so forth. So I think they're in. Are they all in? That depends on the outcome of all of this, but they're certainly in favor of the process and helping as much as they can at this point.
Well, Robin and I are in agreement on this. I think that we have tended to see Pakistan as the obstacle here, but a negotiated outcome in Afghanistan would serve their purposes as long as, Robin points out, it does not leave the country open to enormous or strong Indian influences. Mm-hmm. So I think that we, at this point at least in time, we can expect that the Taliban will be cooperative. However, as soon as they see any kind of developments which do not suit their purposes, they have enormous capacity to be spoilers. They can't make things happen. They can't dictate to the Taliban. They can influence them. They brought them to the table, but they can't tell the Taliban, we expect you're going to compromise this and this. They don't have that kind of influence. But they do have influence because they have, among the Taliban leadership, people who are influenced by them. They have the ability to throw a monkey wrench into things. So for the moment, I think that we will count them among the helpful rather than the unhelpful.
Okay, well then I think that we're going to quit while we're ahead. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but I'm reasonably confident that we're going to be back talking about this issue again in probably the not too distant future. I want to thank Ambassador Raphel and Dr. Weinbaum for joining us here today. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this program, please be sure to subscribe and share it with your friends. You can send us comments on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.